Hi everyone. I hope you're having a beautiful day. Sometimes, the most beautiful beginnings are born from ashes. A few months ago, their company burned to the ground. Everything they'd built, gone in minutes. But today, under the same sky where the fire once raged, Diep and James are back. Not to start over, but to rise again. This isn't just a story about rebuilding a business. It's a story about faith, the kind that refuses to die, even when everything else does. It's about love that doesn't run from the flames, but walks right through them. From ashes to fruit, from loss to life. This is the rebirth of Diep Fruit Co. Bas Lytudiep. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe. Because on this channel, every fall has a comeback, and every heartbreak still finds its way home. The drizzle returned, soft, patient, as if testing the ground that had once burned. Diep stood in the middle of the empty lot, where the earth was still scarred from the fire months ago. Her fingers trembled as she tightened the last screw on a brand new plastic sign, Diep Fruit Co. Ltd. The same name, the same soil, but this time, a different beginning. The old landlord leaned against a post, watching her work, the smell of rain mixing with faint traces of smoke that still lingered in the dirt. "You came back fast," he said, accepting the 5 million dong she handed him. After what happened, most would have left for good. Diep smiled, her voice quiet but steady. "I promised myself I'd rebuild before the ashes got cold. Just a few months ago, everything had turned to fire. The warehouse, the machines, even the first Diep Fruit sign had melted into the mud." She still woke up some nights to the crackling sound in her dreams. But this morning, as the hammer struck steel, the echo didn't sound like fear anymore. It sounded like defiance. The landlord pointed to the blackened wall at the property's edge. Maybe build it higher, to block the noise from that garage? Diep shook her head, a hint of her old fire flashing in her eyes. "No, let it stay open. I want this place quiet enough for traders to hear the fruit ripen, and loud enough for us to remember what we lost." She touched the new sign, its wet surface cold under her fingers. Her voice dropped to a whisper, half prayer, half vow. "From now on, no one decides my fate, not even the fire." Behind her, James stood silently, rain dripping from his jacket, watching the woman who had refused to break. He remembered that night, the flames, her screams, the helplessness. He'd sworn if she ever tried to rebuild, he'd be there. And here they were, standing again, together. Sunlight pierced through the gray morning, scattering over rows of young grapefruit trees. "Come," Diep said, tugging his hand. "You haven't seen how the grove looks now." They walked the narrow path between the trees, 300 of them, each one replanted after the fire. Some leaves still carried burn marks on the edges, but new shoots had sprouted proudly above them. The air was thick with the scent of green peel and wet soil. Diep plucked a cat-quay grapefruit, sliced it open. Juice ran down her wrist, shining in the light. "This," she said softly, "is our second first harvest." James raised an eyebrow. "Second first?" She laughed, wiping her face with her sleeve. "The first one burned, but this one grew from what the fire couldn't kill." He bit into a piece, still sour, but alive. Diep pointed across the grove, voice picking up strength. "Fook track there, sugar grapefruit here, thornless honey pineapple on that side. Peels for jam, for shampoo, for fertilizer. Nothing wasted this time." James watched her, the way her hands moved, the way her eyes lit up with that fierce hope. She wasn't building a business anymore. She was rebuilding a soul. 1 month from now, she continued, when these turn golden and sweet, I want you to sign the first export contract again. But I want our story on the label. Let them know this brand was born twice. James nodded, pride swelling in his chest. Then let's make sure it never burns again. She smiled. Even if it does, we'll plant again, because now I know we can. He looked at her, the mud-streaked boots, the scar on her arm from that night, the spark in her eyes. She was no longer the girl who begged luck from the streets. She was the woman who had learned to wrestle destiny back with her bare hands. That night, the rain softened into a hum. The tin roof ticked with each drop. Inside the small rebuilt shack, warmth glowed from a single bulb. Nee lifted a Coke bottle, offering it proudly in order. Grandma Huyen first, then Aunt Diep, then Uncle James. Laughter filled the room. Smoke from the grill twisted into the light. Mrs. Huyen smiled, eyes glistening. To my children, she said, raising her glass, for turning loss into life. Diep's voice trembled. To the ones who stood through the fire and didn't run. James clinked his glass gently. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her said everything. Gratitude, admiration, love. Around them, the world was simple again. Knees giggles, chopsticks clicking, rain whispering outside. No gold chandeliers, no champagne, just a roof that didn't leak and hearts that refused to give up. Mrs. Huyen leaned over the table, her tone warm. If you ever need capital again, tell Mom. Diep smiled, shaking her head. This time, we'll make it with our own hands. I'll make you proud. I'll give Nee a future. And I'll make sure James never has to choose between love and duty again. Under the table, James reached for her hand. It was rough, warm, real. Nee raised her Coke bottle again. Clink. The sound echoed, soft and sweet, like bells in the rain. Outside, Don barked twice from the porch as the drizzle faded into silence. Above them, the moon climbed slowly through the clouds, its light landing on the new Diep fruit sign. The letters gleamed silver. Same name, same soil. But this time, it was unburnable. Because some dreams, once tested by fire, never break again. Morning broke with the smell of wet soil and smoke still faint in the air. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that reminds. Two Diep stood on the wooden platform, clipboard in hand, as a truck rolled through the gate carrying the first shipment of packaging boxes. Each was stamped with the same words she'd written by hand a year ago and lost to the flames. Diep fruit, from the heart of Vietnam. James hopped down from the driver's seat, wiping sweat from his brow. They're all here, he said. 50 boxes, printed fresh. Diep ran her fingers over the logo, tracing the curve of each letter as if it were a scar she was proud to wear. I thought I'd never see this again. James smiled. You didn't just see it again. You made it happen again. She turned toward him, voice soft. No, we did. By noon, the air buzzed with life. Workers, mostly old neighbors who'd come back after the fire, unloaded crates, cleaned equipment, and tied bright ribbons around the new tanks. The smell of ripe fruit filled the yard, sweet and sharp. Mrs. Huyen stood in the shade, watching, her hands clasped tightly. Nee ran circles around her, laughing, clutching a small fruit sticker that read, Batch 01, Reborn. Uncle James, she shouted, waving. Can I stick this one on the first box? James knelt down. Of course, but promise me you'll write your name on it too. She giggled, scribbling knee next to the logo. So people know I helped rebuild Diep Fruit. Diep's heart swelled at the sight, a small hand leaving a mark where ashes once lay. Then came the sound they'd been waiting for. The deep hum of the generator, the machine lights flickering to life. Everyone stopped for a second, looking at Diep. She nodded once. Start the line. The conveyor belts began to move, slow at first, then steady. Grapefruits rolled forward, shiny and golden under the new lamps. A cheer rose across the yard. Diep exhaled. For months, she'd dreamed of this sound, the rhythm of survival. James came beside her, whispering, "We're back." She looked up at him, eyes bright with tears. "No, James. We never left. We were just waiting for the right season to bloom again." Evening settled in soft and gold. The factory lights glowed like stars over the grove. Inside the small office, Diep sat at the wooden desk, flipping through the new export papers. The ink was still drying. The contract lay before her. The same company that had canceled after the fire was now offering to partner again. James leaned against the doorway, watching her read. They signed? She nodded slowly, almost not believing it herself. They signed. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Diep laughed, a quiet, trembling sound that broke into joy. "You remember how I cried the night they withdrew?" He chuckled. "You mean when you threw your phone at me?" "Exactly," she grinned. "This time I might throw it again, but for happiness." He stepped closer, pulling her into a gentle hug. "You earned this, Diep, every bit of it." She leaned against his shoulder, whispering, "We both did." Outside, through the office window, she could see the rebuilt warehouse glowing softly under the moonlight. Tin roof, clean walls, and that same sign standing tall at the gate. But this time, the sign wasn't just a dream. It was a story, written in fire and rebuilt with love. Later that night, they gathered again, the same small circle as before. Grandma Huyen, Nee, James, and Diep. Dinner was simple. Rice, fish sauce, and a bowl of fresh grapefruit slices, their first successful batch. Nee lifted a slice to her lips, eyes lighting up. "Sweet," she squealed, "not sour anymore." James laughed. "Just like your aunt's temper these days." Diep gave him a playful shove. "Careful, or I'll make you peel all 300 trees yourself." Grandma Huyen chuckled, the lines around her eyes softening. "When I saw the fire that night, I thought I'd lost you both, not just the company. But here you are, stronger than ever." Diep reached over, squeezing her mother's hand. "The fire took what we built, but not why we built it." James raised his glass. "To new beginnings, and to everything that refuses to die." They clinked glasses. The sound was small but full, echoing against the tin roof. Outside, dawn barked, chasing fireflies along the grove's edge. The moonlight glinted off the grapefruit leaves, some still carrying faint burn marks, each one a reminder of how close they came to losing it all. Diep stepped out to the porch, letting the night wind brush against her face. The air was sweet with citrus and rain. Behind her, she heard Nee's laughter and the clatter of dishes, the music of life returning. James joined her, sliding his arm around her shoulders. "So," he murmured, "what now?" Diep smiled, eyes on the glowing sign beyond the gate. "Now, we grow. We teach others to rebuild like we did. I want our name to stand for something, not just fruit, but faith." James nodded. And maybe rest a bit too? She laughed quietly. Rest after harvest. They stood there together, the night wrapping around them, the grove whispering softly with the wind. In the distance, the Diep Fruitio Ltd. sign gleamed silver under the moonlight, strong and steady, a symbol of everything they had lost and everything they had dared to create again. This time, it wasn't just a company. It was proof. Proof that love can survive loss, that dreams can burn and still come back sweeter, that what fire destroys, faith can rebuild, brighter, stronger, unbreakable. Months after a devastating fire reduced their first company to ashes, Diep and James returned to the same land, not to mourn, but to rebuild. With scarred hands and unbroken hearts, they plant again, rebrand again, and dare to dream again. Every hammer strike, every sprouting grapefruit tree, every shared meal in their small shack becomes proof that hope doesn't vanish in the fire. It's refined by it. What burned was the building. What remained was their love, their faith, and the will to rise.